And I see this as a largely unmet need for many people, and have always been driven by a desire to change how we understand mental illness and how we heal emotional distress in an effective, safe, and timely manner. And this is mainly what led me to an interest in clinical psychology and our discussions today. It is lovely being here with you today, so thank you for having me.
Thanks, Evie. So my name's Amy Stephenson. I'm Head of Health and Wellbeing at Turning Point. So Turning Point, as was briefly mentioned, is a national social enterprise, and we provide health and social care services across England, predominantly drug and alcohol, mental health and learning disability support services. So my role at Turning Point is to develop broad and holistic approaches to how we support health and wellbeing, both for people accessing our services, but also from a colleague perspective, which is of course what we're here for today. My background is in public health, but I was introduced to CBT at that point, so it's something I'm familiar with through the different work I've done, and also at Turning Point it's something that we use to support people who access some of our mental health and our substance misuse services. So the relevance for me being here, I suppose, is that Turning Point used the Right Steps support and the CBT support to enable us to make sure that some of the quality and the evidence-based practice that we use in our services translates to our preventative and reactive sometimes approach to how we support good wellbeing across the workforce as well. So great to be here.
Thank you both. So there's been a huge increase in the awareness and importance of supporting employee mental health and wellbeing over the last few years. And with this, there's come an increase in the options available to employers as the market has responded. However, it might not always be easy to understand what the most appropriate form of support for a particular need might be. So today we'll be taking a bit of time to focus on the subject of cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. So guided by Dr. Evie, we'll explore some of the myths associated with CBT and build our understanding of CBT, whilst Amy will lead the conversation around the role CBT can play as part of a portfolio of employee support options. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to ask any questions you might have, pop them in the Q&A, and we'll do our very best to answer as many as we can. So Evie, whilst many of us have heard of CBT, I think it's fair to say that people don't really understand what it is, what it can be used for, or why it's a therapeutic approach that they can have confidence in, not just for themselves, but for the employees within their organisation as well. Perhaps it might be useful for us to start by exploring this topic.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, CBT certainly is a widely utilised therapeutic approach, and it is really great that we're having this opportunity today to discuss more about some of these common myths and misconceptions, as you said, that often exist around it. But also we can discuss how it really works, how it actually works. Cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, is a type of psychotherapeutic treatment, a talking therapy that can help people to manage their difficulties by identifying and by changing any unhelpful behaviors and any maladaptive thought patterns, any unhelpful thinking styles that are having a significant, a sustained, and adverse impact on their mental health and more generally our quality of life. It is a short-term model of therapy, so it can occur in a relatively short period of time, usually to 16 sessions, and people can therefore complete it over a period of weeks or a few months, rather than years, as we see in other types of psychological treatment. And another great benefit of this intervention is that it is very easily adaptable and can be delivered in a variety of ways. For example, not only by one-to-one, face-to-face sessions and more traditional, if you like, type of formats, but also by utilizing online or telephone or text or video call formats. And research supports CBT as a safe and effective treatment And it is recommended by NICE, by our National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, for a wide range of mental health difficulties, for example, for anxiety, for depression, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And there are also some disorder-specific adaptations of CBT. For example, many of you may have heard of things like rumination-focused CBT for depression, or trauma-focused CBT, which is another adaptation used to help people with while experiencing PTSD symptoms, or post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. Or some of you may be aware of other adaptations, for example, aimed at grief, assertiveness, or anger issues. We also know that many of us are experiencing mental health difficulties alongside a physical health problem, which might be impacting our symptom severity and how we perceive these symptoms. And again, in these cases, CBT is an evidence-based treatment. So it is a safe and effective treatment for things like chronic pain, or people experiencing chronic fatigue, insomnia, and other types of sleep difficulties.
Thank you, Evie. So CBT clearly has a strong evidence base, which is certainly something that any employer needs to be cognizant of when selecting support or options for its employees. But how does it actually work? So most people have heard of cognitive behavioural therapy or its acronym, but perhaps they won't understand, or they may even misunderstand the process, as we do know there are a lot of myths and misconceptions around the subject.
Yes, absolutely, Claire. Well, CBT is based on the concept that our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors are all interconnected. It's based on the concept that how we think about situations can really affect the way we feel, and how we think about situations can really affect the way we behave. In other words, the real inside of the CBT model, I think, is that it's not events that can really bother us. Instead, it's the way that we interpret these events. So the meaning that we make of our experiences that gives rise to our feelings. And if we think about this really explains why two people experiencing the same event can react in completely different ways. So let's consider the example on your screen, and I will give you a moment to do this if that's okay. So in the top row of this diagram, we can see that we interpret the event that someone didn't speak to us on the street quite negatively. Yes, because we immediately start thinking, what have I done wrong? And because we think like that, understandably, this results in feelings of stress and anxiety. In the bottom row, we can take a look at a different way to interpret that same event and how this can impact differently on how we feel as a result. So we're able to see how this different interpretation of our friend's behavior in more neutral terms actually leads to a very different outcome. And again, as we interpret the event in a more neutral manner, this understandably results in a very different emotional state. So we are able to remain relaxed, we're able to remain calm, or we may even feel concerned about the other person. And of course, for the top row scenario, where we think that we must have done something wrong, and we think that the person can see us, but chooses not to speak to us, well, we may choose to walk away too. We may choose to avoid speaking to them, which in turn cannot actually help us to confirm or disconfirm our beliefs in the first place. So CBT addresses not only the role of unhelpful and quite often overly negative thoughts and beliefs that we all have, but also the role of unhelpful behaviors and unhelpful coping strategies that we have adopted over the years in order to manage any unpleasant and uncomfortable emotions, and the role of these coping strategies in maintaining our worries and our fears and our difficulties in the long run. And this is another interesting example of a person who is experiencing menopause-related symptoms at work. So they are experiencing hot flashes at work, where again we know from research that CBT can be a safe and effective treatment in reducing the frequency and the severity and the overall impact of these symptoms, and it can improve people's quality of life. And if we take a closer look at the example on our screen, we can all hopefully see that our thoughts and feelings about our symptoms can really impact differently the severity of our symptoms. For example, any unhelpful and again overly negative thoughts, for example, I can't cope with these symptoms anymore, or people will laugh at me, or feeling embarrassed or feeling stressed, can actually make the physical sensation of these hot flashes worse, leading therefore to a vicious and unhelpful cycle where the more severe our symptoms, the more negatively we will think and we will feel about them, which again will keep impacting our perception of these symptoms and our overall menopause experience. And as I was saying earlier, our behavior and coping strategies for any uncomfortable, any unpleasant feelings we may have, although they may be helpful admittedly in the short term, in terms of being able to bring our stress levels down and reducing any discomfort we may be experiencing. And for example, in this scenario, we may choose to walk away, we may choose to hide our face each time we experience a hot flash. Well, these coping strategies, they can quickly reduce any feelings of embarrassment that we may be experiencing in that moment, but they can also keep maintaining all of these unhelpful thoughts and unhelpful beliefs in the long run and every time we get these symptoms. Because we didn't stay in the situation in order to test out how accurate our initial thought was. In this scenario, we are not able, for example, to check how other people will indeed respond if they were able to see us having a hot flash, or perhaps if they will even notice. And CBT is about, well, it's more than just changing our thoughts. It sounds quite simplistic, but it isn't, as it can take a lot of time and tremendous effort, I think, at times to overcome any unhelpful, but nevertheless, let's not forget, very well used and over-familiar to us thinking patterns. It is important to identify and to learn what thoughts, what feelings, situations that are contributing to our symptoms and our difficulties. However, this process can be quite difficult, especially for people who might struggle with introspection. But I think taking the time to identify this can provide some really useful insights that are essential to the treatment process. And also during therapy sessions, we're also taught a lot of many different new skills that need to be practiced in real world situations. So it's not just about what is happening during the session. For example, someone with substance misuse difficulties might need to keep practicing these new and healthier and more helpful coping skills and keep rehearsing ways to manage, for example, social situations that could potentially trigger a relapse. And there are many more myths and misconceptions around CBT. For example, fortunately, CBT is not about trying to simply think of baseless positive thoughts, or it's not about repeating positive affirmations. The truth is that CBT is not asking us to disregard any negative thoughts. It's not asking us to avoid addressing any negative events and influences in our lives, because we know from our clinical experience, from our personal experience, I'm sure that simply ignoring and disregarding these, or trying to think overly positively, would not make any real difference in helping us to feel better, at least in the long run. So instead, the real focus of CBT is on balanced thinking, and balanced thinking entails thinking about all the information and all the evidence in a situation which affects our how we feel, our emotional state. And CBT is not a single psychotherapy using a one-size-fits-all approach. As we know that there is no single best therapy that can work for everyone. In different cases, for different individuals, a custom-tailored therapy approach is always needed. One size fits all is not applicable, I would say, for the complexity of the human experience. So CBT therefore includes a very wide range of techniques and approaches. For example, dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, compassion-focused therapy, schema therapy, all taking a different approach in addressing any unhelpful underlying patterns that might be contributing to our psychological distress. And as I was saying before, these techniques are not applicable to all issues, and they can never be appropriate for everyone. And I think that this common misconception that CBT can work for everyone and for everything can actually greatly exaggerate its usefulness as a panacea for all, when in reality, I think CBT is most useful when used by appropriately trained professionals, when used for specific problems, and always in conjunction with other techniques and approaches.
Thank you, Evie. That was, really, really interesting. So the evidence base is strong, and we can see the real world benefits for actual employees. But what's the difference between CBT and other types of therapy? And how would somebody know where to direct an individual, or what was most appropriate for them?
Really interesting questions. Thank you, Claire. So there is certainly some confusion between all the different types of therapy, for example, psychotherapy, counseling, CBT. But the truth is that many people could benefit from any type of evidence-based therapeutic approach. And this is because people can have the opportunity to talk to a professional, to talk to a non-judgmental and supportive professional who can help them to better understand their difficulties and can help them to identify some useful strategies to help them manage their difficulties more effectively. I'd say that psychotherapy is often used as this kind of umbrella term that covers all talking therapies, including counseling and including CBT. And it's also used to describe other types of talking therapy, such as psychodynamic psychotherapy, which are longer term than CBT. So giving people the opportunity to explore deeper issues and deeper internal conflicts, if you like, that cannot be fully addressed in CBT. So CBT focuses on people's past experiences, yes, but it does this in order to help them make sense of the current difficulties. So the main focus still remains on the here and now, whereas other psychotherapies can be particularly helpful to people when unresolved difficulties from childhood or adolescence, for example, are really getting in the way of making changes in their lives now. And on the other hand, counseling is particularly helpful for people trying to adjust to difficult circumstances that cannot be changed. For example, following a job loss, or for people who are experiencing bereavement. Or counseling can be also really helpful if people are not really sure what the problem is, or they're not really sure whether they want something to change or how they may want something to change. For example, when we experience relationship difficulties in life. And there are several challenges that people may face when engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy, and we can see a few on this slide. Well, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy tends to be more structured than other approaches. So it is agenda focused, and in that way, it may not be suitable for people who may find this process difficult. And of course, for any therapy to be effective, we need to spend time and effort acknowledging and analyzing our thoughts and analyzing our behaviors. And this process can feel difficult for many of us. But it is such a great way to learn more about ourselves and learn more about how our internal states, our feelings are there for a reason. So acknowledging how our emotions are there to serve a wide range of purposes in life, from alerting us to danger, to helping us build, for example, better and closer social connections. And of course, ambivalence is to be expected. Many of our usual coping strategies that we are using, although some of them may be less helpful, may have formed over a very long period of time. So changing them cannot happen overnight, as you can imagine, and our motivation can inevitably fluctuate, sometimes daily, as we're really trying to develop these new ways of living our life. So I would say that CBT is a gradual process that helps us take incremental steps towards positive changes in our lives. For example, someone with social anxiety, which was one of your questions that we received ahead of this webinar. This was a question about people who are experiencing significant anxiety around public speaking. And yes, CBT is an effective treatment for social anxiety. So a person experiencing social anxiety might start by simply imagining the situation, and then next they may practice speaking from the family and friends, whilst practicing useful skills and techniques which can help them to test out, to confirm or disconfirm any of these unhelpful thoughts and beliefs that they may have about their ability to do that. And so by progressively working towards our goal, the process can feel less daunting and our goal easier to achieve. But this is all from an individual's perspective, and I would like to invite Amy here to discuss what might be important to consider from an employer's perspective. Amy?
Thanks, Evie. Yeah, so it's an interesting one to reflect on, and these were some of the points that I thought about from our experience at Turning Point of having CBT as an option for our colleagues. So the first one that I wanted to share was around considering how you increase how CBT helps you to increase awareness of mental health and of reducing stigma generally. So despite the fact that mental health problems affect thousands of us in the UK, stigma and misunderstanding still exist around mental health. We often talk about mental health when we're actually meaning mental ill health. And even as a provider of mental health services, we know that we need to continue to help to change perceptions within the workforce and nudge across society as well. So for us, providing CBT and being able to explain how and what it is can be helpful to help educate across the organisation and provide an inclusive environment for people with different needs, including those with mental health concerns or existing mental ill health. The second point I wanted to share was around making access and availability to CBT as easy as you can. So as with any intervention that's designed to improve someone's health and well-being, it can make no difference at all if there are barriers to using it in the first place. So some of our learning has been around how we help people to get to that point of thinking about and accessing CBT. Now for us, because we use Right Steps, that already allows people to access in their own time and place from different devices, be that online or through the telephone support that's available, but there might be different barriers and enablers for different workplaces. And I just wanted to share something that we did. So one of the things that we did was engage with colleagues across Turning Point to understand from their perspective what might help or inhibit people from accessing CBT in the first place. And we learned a number of things, but some of the key points I wanted to mention was that it needs to be something that people can access directly, or at least that's what our colleagues told us. So we originally had a pathway whereby people could be referred by their managers, and actually what people wanted was to just be able to access quickly, easily themselves without their manager even having to know. So that was one of the things for us that was a consideration. And it was also really important that people know that it's a confidential service and nothing would be shared with their manager or employee. Now, depending whether you already have CBT available through employment, you're thinking about it, or whether it's something that you're thinking more about encouraging people to access from an external provider or a local provider. That was that might be some difference there, but that was one of the things that's really important for our workforce around knowing that whatever support they access through us is confidential. And again, linked to access and availability is communication. So communication again is so important because people won't access something if they don't know about it in the first place. So I would say to consider the most effective channels to let people know about CBT, how it works, how they can access it. And again, for us, we have lots of different ways that people can do that, but that will look different for different organisations. I just wanted to talk about catering for different needs. So I've alluded to already a couple of times around different needs amongst different people or teams, and Evie's already mentioned that CBT is something that might not be for everyone. But what I think for us, it's also been really important to remember that although being in good work and having good employment in itself is a big driver for someone's overall health and wellbeing outcomes, there are also other big factors at play. So things like people's living situation, family worries, financial situations. There's lots of things that go on around people that can impact on their health and well-being, particularly at the moment as we think about rising energy prices, entering a cost of living crisis. There'll be inevitable impacts on the back of that as well for some people more than others. So in the grand scheme of things, there's very little we can do around some of those external risk factors or protective factors that happen outside the workplace. But I think for us, it's been important to remember that in terms of the context and thinking about how CBT can fit into that as a way of helping people to manage their emotional health and reflect on different areas of their life that they may need some support with or that they have some control over. So the fourth area is around fostering a mentally healthy workforce. We're probably all here with an ambition around doing this. So productivity of an organisation is affected by the well-being of the workforce. We all probably know that. And even at Turning Point, we're a non-for-profit organisation, but we know that the health and well-being of people who access our services and our ability to provide them with the best service is dependent on the well-being of our colleagues. So providing CBT can help people from reaching that crisis point, as well as being a support when a problem has already arisen. And can contribute towards some of those bigger factors in relation to retention or productivity. And then the final point that I just wanted to mention is around making a difference and how you know that CBT is making a difference. So measuring things like access, impact, change is really difficult. And changes to things like absenteeism or presenteeism, some of those big measures that we look at when we're thinking about employee wellbeing should be reviewed regularly, but you can't always pinpoint exactly what's caused a change in trajectory or a trend when it comes to those big figures. So I guess Evie's already talked about the fact that aside from quantitative data, CBT is an evidence-based approach. It's safe and effective treatment. But I would say around noticing a difference is to think about to consider the qualitative information. So gathering feedback from people who've used CBT to help demonstrate and understand its worth as part of the package of support that you might offer to your teams. And I just wanted to share a couple of quotes before we move on to a point of reflection from a couple of people who've accessed CBT at Turning Point. So the first one being, my outlook on life has totally changed for the better, and I see things in a more positive manner rather than the negative manner I tainted everything in my life with at the time. And the second one is, I've now returned to work with my enthusiasm and confidence renewed. My family, friends and work colleagues have all noticed a difference in my mood and say I'm back to my old self. And I hope that demonstrates sometimes how some of the stories and the feedback that you can hear around the realities of people using CBT, and some of you shared when you signed up for this webinar, which was great to see that you've experienced CBT as well. So to not underestimate how some of the stories and the qualitative information can help us to understand the difference that something like this can make for people.
Thank you, Amy. That was really, really positive. And the good news is we've got some questions. So I'm going to start off with you, I think, Amy. So what are the most effective ways an organisation can support good mental health in your vast years of experience?
Yeah, so and I think a lot of these questions have come from some of those questions that were asked at the start when people were signing up, so which was great for us to have a think about. So I've covered a lot already that answers some of the effective ways that we can support good mental health as an organisation. But just some other points to bring in. So I think creating we need to think about how we create a culture of well-being and how we support mental health culturally throughout the way that we work as organisations. That will help people in accessing things like CBT. So some of the things that I kind of reflect on when I think about that kind of cultural shift is around being clear on the why. So thinking about why are things like CBT or other support that you may have important? What are the benefits from different perspectives, from employers themselves, managers, as an organisation? So I think that's really important to embed a culture that embraces and supports mental health, is to keep that why at the heart of it, around why we do these things, why we bring in support like CBT. Using various touch points to reiterate your commitment and to support good mental health, and that will look different across different organisations, but you'll have lots of different ways in which you can get across messages or have conversations about mental health. And yeah, there'll be various opportunities for you to do that, but that are important. I mentioned managers briefly a moment ago. So leaders and management and managers have a really influential role in terms of building a culture that supports mental health, that enables people to access and be comfortable in talking about and accessing support that's available. So to think about the role of leaders and managers and how they can be role models themselves, as well as being often the ones who can take some action if they notice a difference in people or if they've had a conversation. And linking to this is also senior leadership buy-in is really important around creating a culture that supports mental health. And sharing of experience, I probably have mentioned this already, I might mention it again, but that stories can be really impactful for us, and wherever they come from, but sharing experience of of our different states of mental health and our experience of accessing services to normalise the reality that people have different experiences around mental health at different times. Taking a proactive approach as well as reactive is really important. So I think I've kind of talked to that a little bit already, but the importance of not just waiting until you notice something might be wrong or somebody tells you that they need support, but thinking about how you build the comms and the conversations into everyday practice as far as you can, and to know what support is available. So be that whether you're the ones that are providing as an employer CBT or other support options through employment, but also knowing what's available locally and nationally if you don't have that in-house support. So when those conversations arise, knowing where to direct people for support is really important. So I think those are some of the things that I could add to respond to that question around effective ways of an organisation supporting good mental health.
Really great answer, thanks Amy, really comprehensive. One more for you if that's okay. So what can I as an employer do to encourage a colleague to access CBT?
Yeah, it's a really good question around that shifting into action. And I think some of the points that Evie has covered cover some of this already as well. But I think from our experience as an employer, it's being clear on and communicating well what CBT is and what it isn't. So some of the points that you've listened to today around being able to directly reiterate that or get ways of communicating that so people are really clear on what it is. Sometimes some of the barriers to getting to it can exist a lot earlier than actually making that phone call or getting through to the support that's there. I talked previously about making access easy, and I can't reiterate this enough, particularly if whether you provide CBT in-house or whether you're reliant on local services that you can direct people to, whatever you can do to help people get there and make that access easy in the first place is really important, because often providers can't do that bit for you, although they will try. And the final point that I would say is just to reiterate that around how to encourage colleagues to access CBT. If you yourself have accessed it before, or you know people in the organisation or colleagues who have, is to see if people are happy to share their experience. And that I mentioned some people who'd signed up to this webinar let us know that they've experienced CBT. So yeah, just around sharing some of those stories or your own experience if you have it.
Fantastic, thank you. Evie, so quite an interesting one for you, I think. So how would I choose the right CBT therapist? It's a short question, but I think there may be a bit of a longer answer.
I would say take a look at the therapist's website or a therapist directory listing to see whether they have detailed training or qualifications that are specific to cognitive behavioral therapy. Also, I think choosing a therapist who is a member of a body with an accredited register, such as the BABCP, really means that you know that they are highly qualified and they do adhere to high ethical and practice standards. And I think it's a great question, and I feel that your decision shouldn't be a rash decision. But I think that these are important steps that should really help you then in making the right one.
Fantastic, thank you. And I'm just going to ask one more question before we move on. So it's quite a long one, so bear with me. So what CBT techniques can be utilised when the main ones don't work for me? Or what should I do if I'm not finding CBT beneficial?
CBT is not a quick fix. And as we were saying earlier, it will not necessarily work for everyone. Also, we need to bear in mind that it will also feel difficult, perhaps, at times to put in the time and effort. Our motivation, we talked about how it can naturally fluctuate, especially if we're experiencing significant mental health difficulties. I would say it is important to speak to your therapist. And if any of the tasks seem too hard or they don't seem to be helping, your therapist will not ask you to do things you don't want to do. And a good therapist will pace your sessions and work with you to decide what to do in your sessions, so allowing you to feel more in control in that way. I would also say support from family and friends can also be very helpful. For example, they can help you to face your fears. You will be doing things between sessions, like practicing new skills that can be a great help during those times. They can help you to develop a structure to your day or do things that can help you improve your emotional health and well-being in general. But as we said earlier, CBT isn't for everyone, and other types of treatments or medication may also be helpful. So if this is not the right time for the person, they can always try CBT in the future if they don't want to do it now. But I would emphasize that I would also say that it's always important to speak to your therapist and discuss what the barriers are for you and how you think you can overcome this. So what do you think can help you overcome these barriers? So I hope this helps. So,
Okay.
So how can we get started? Let's go back to our slides then. Unless you have more questions, Claire.
No, it's good. Fire away.
Okay. So how do we get started? Well, as I was just saying, it is important that we speak to our GP or a mental health care professional who can understand our needs and signpost us to available support options if, of course, this is appropriate. But during these discussions, I think we should also take some time to consider our own personal preferences, including, for example, whether face-to-face or over the phone or online therapy will work best for us. And opening up to other people about how we feel can feel daunting, admittedly. So it is really helpful to do this with an open mind and a positive attitude as much as you can, that is, because we know that having enough support around us or having the right support in place for our own needs can really help remind us, can really help us learn or relearn a lot of those great and useful strategies that can make a real difference and significantly improve our overall mental health and well-being. And mainly from an employer's perspective, how can we really start these conversations with our staff?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's kind of three main things that I think about when I think about how to get started around CBT within a workplace. And the first one being conversation is key. So do what you can to initiate and enable conversations about CBT and about the offer that's available to people, be that internally or externally. So you might want to consider prompts or questions in things like supervision or one-to-one templates. You might want to share information or resources in team meetings, could ask people who've access to share their experiences, I've mentioned already, if and where they're comfortable. But again, thinking about where are those touch points to have and enable conversations. I've put up here a useful framework that I've used in relation to other types of conversations, but I think it lends itself quite nicely here in terms of having a really effective conversation that will help someone, because what nobody's expecting you to do is be an expert in CBT yourself. So this framework is around ask, advise and act. So the first ask area being around asking if people have heard about CBT, if they know what it is. Advising then is around advising on how CBT can support. So advising around what you know of CBT. This isn't advising on what people should do. You can leave that to the experts and to the professionals, but advising on what you know in relation to CBT. And then acting, importantly. So then at that point, letting people know what's available to them and how to access support. And you can use this framework in lots of different ways. A conversation that comes up ad hoc within a supervision, so more of a systematic approach, or team meetings. But it's just a way of thinking about how you move the conversation on to people knowing what's available to help them, knowing that we can't without being the therapists ourselves. The second point then is around getting managers on board. I've emphasised already how important this is. Managers play a pivotal role in letting people know what is available by leading by example and ensuring that people are able to access. So the getting managers on board, I'd say, would be a key element around getting started. And then the final point is around planning your communications. So you can do this in advance. And I talked a little bit about how we can consider different methods of communication that are effective to your workplace. But thinking about things like national campaigns, there's a lot of national campaigns that come up in relation to physical, social, emotional health that can link in, tie in nicely to some of those themes that Evie's talked about, some of those links that can give you an opportunity to talk about CBT and how that might fit. So plan ahead, think about your comms at whatever scale they're at for you as an organisation, and think about where those comms sit, those touch points, those levers for you as an employer, how you can let people know. And just to add to some additional things that we've done things like adding information onto pay slips, which is obviously something that people will look at. So pay slips is something that's worked for us around putting messages in there, lock screens on computers, thinking creatively about where people are going to have conversations or what people are going to see, which again will look very different for different employers. So those are 3 things around getting started that you might want to think about from an organisational perspective. And I'm going to pass over to Claire now.
Fantastic. So thank you so much both. It's been really informative and interesting. So I'm just going to try to summarise. So mental health is an area that has come with a tremendous stigma over the years. The need for psychological support has been particularly high in recent years, yet the number of people we've seen accessing services is much lower, and this is partly, I think, from what you've mentioned from the stigma. So my takeaway is that through learning the concepts of CBT, as well as through the examination of our own cognitive distortions and unhelpful beliefs, we can all play a role in changing how CBT is regarded. And if we share our learnings with friends, colleagues, family members, we can make a real impact in terms of reducing the stigma that is holding so many people back from getting the help and support that they need. And also for me, developing a deeper understanding of our inner belief systems and creating a way to reframe any unhelpful thoughts, behaviours and actions can help us all. So I'm going to embrace it. And then finally, I'd like to thank This Can Happen for partnering us with this webinar today. And then if you need further advice and guidance, if today has really interested you, you want to know more, first of all, I'd like to thank you for attending, as I know would Evie and Amy, and I hope you found the session helpful and useful. I hope you learned some things and you've got some stuff to take away that you didn't come with today. On the screen's a list of resources, so you can access them if you want to explore this topic further. And also, it's probably worth just making a note of our contact details at the right step. So we not only deliver CBT, but also lots of other types of therapy, menopause-specific, trauma-focused, etc., along with a range of other wellbeing solutions too. So if you've got any questions about what we've discussed today, or how we could potentially work with you and your organisation, we'd love to chat to you. So please reach out. Last thing from me is to wish you all a wonderful afternoon. I'm hopeful that our paths may cross again, and take care, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And just a reminder, the meeting has been recorded, so will be sent to yourself once the webinar has concluded. and there is also a feedback link coming through to yourselves in just a few moments' time. Thank you very much.